When it comes to war and oil, what often comes to mind is thoughts of the Middle East wars. But since the discovery of oil in 1850, this forever changed how war was fought and what wars were fought over. The decade of the 1850s saw a period was the great political debate of its time. The debate of slavery. This debate went on for over a decade, finally boiling over into a full-blown war. This war was known as the American Civil War. Other countries had ended slavery, but it still remains in the United States. During the 19th century, coal was the primary source of power. The coal-powered steam engines. This led to things like the train as well as steam powerboats. The breakthrough in such technology played a great role in the United States' westward expansion. Steam powerboats also led to the expansion of global travel. These were the early days of global trade as we know it today. The internal combustion engine was invented in the 1870s. This invention set in motion of the new millennium, both the discovery of oil and the invention of the combustion engine. Humanity took a giant leap forward. As the 20th century was starting, this new advances in technology lead to a power struggle of global power. During the steam engine era, it was the British that ruled the seas. By the end of the 19th century, the idea of air travel began. This would not be possible without oil and the internal combustion engine. In the year 1914, we saw the start of the First World War. This war was the first to use aeroplanes as well as tanks, none of which would be possible without oil. The First World War was fought in Europe, but America was the largest known source of oil. Before the First World War, warfare fought in the Napoleonic style. People would line up in rows and shot each other, and cannons were used. The cannon was up until the tank the most powerful weapon in war. The threat of the tank led to trench warfare. Another new invention, the airplane, was first used during this war. Up until this time, the country with the greatest navy was the world's superpower. The airplane now made war international. The First World War was not truly global but changed in a few decades. In 1939, World War II started. This war was the first to use bombers as the primary military weapons of war. This war, unlike World War I, was fought in Asia as well as Europe. Since Japan had eliminated resources, it invented China, a country rich in natural resources. If Japan were to become an empire of the 20th century, it would need oil. When most people think of World War II, they think of Germany in 1939, but the war really started with Japan and China in 1937. This led to the United States putting an oil embargo on Japan in 1940. The embargo is what many people believe is the reason for the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Could World War II have been the first wars fought over oil? Not only did we have the conflict of the Pacific, Germany needed to fuel its war machines. This led them to expand into North Africa and the Middle East, where the oil-rich countries were. It was around this time that oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia. Before this, America was the country with largest oil reserves. During World War II, America was the manufacturing center for the Allies' forces. It was the large surplus of energy that allowed for this. Oil fueled the war machines, but it also fuels the production of the warfare state. The Second World War ended with a nuclear bomb being dropped on Japan. This was the start of the nuclear age. This period was also known as the Cold War era. This time it was nuclear energy, not oil. But within oil to fuel the rockets and bombers. The war was not only an arms race, but it was also a space race. The Second World War saw the first use of rockets. This rocket technology leads to the first satellites, then led to the first man in space, and finally the first man on the moon by a century early, man only traveling by train across continents. The Cold War era was an arms race between American capitalist and communist Russia. The Cold War became just after the Second World War ended. Also, the time saw the discovery of the largest oil field in Saudi Arabia. The country would later play a large role in geopolitical tensions during the period known as the Cold War. There was two true wars: the Vietnam War and the Korean War. These wars were an indirect war with Communist Russia without starting another world war. By the late 60s, the cost of the Vietnam War, among other things, resulted in America running huge budget deficits. After World War II, the United States was the world reserve currency, since it was the only economy not affected by the World War. But its status as the world reserve currency was being threatened because the other countries were questioning whether the dollar was being backed by gold. In 1971, President Nixon ended the gold standard. It was not until 1973 when what is known as the petrodollar system started. Since Saudi Arabia had the largest oil field, a deal was made with the Saudis to sell their oil for dollars only. The Saudis were to buy American bonds and trade for the American military to protect and sell military weapons. The dollar went from being backed by gold to being backed by the global oil trade. This allowed the United States to now have limitless money to fund the warfare state. The system allowed the United States to use the dollar in the financial war. Many people believe this played a large role in ending the Cold War. Russia got much of its revenue from oil. By lowering the price of oil, it financially crippled the Soviet Union. In 1989, the Soviet Union fell and the Cold War was over. The 90s were a decade of relative peace. This all changed on September 11, 2001. When terrorists hijacked planes and flew them into the World Trade Center. A month later, the war on terror, when we began an invasion of Afghanistan due to the fact the terrorist group responsible was hiding out in Afghanistan. A year later, our government claimed Iraqi had weapons of mass destruction. By the spring of 2003, we invaded Iraq. The justification was about weapons of mass destruction. Others try to say it was about spreading freedom and democracy. But neither of these things were true. The true reason was Iraqi's government was starting to sell their oil for euros, not dollars. This was a threat to the petrodollar system. No one would go to war just to defend the dollar as reserve currency. Currently, several countries are against the petrodollar system: Iran, Russia, China, and Venezuela. What do most of these countries have in common? The answer is oil. By having the dollar being the majority of oil trades, these back the dollar by oil.